Good morning, everyone. It's Chris Lindgren with Mass Bio. Welcome. We're very glad to have you here today. I'm just going to wait about 20 seconds to let our attendees populate. We've got about 25 people online right now. Thanks for your patience. Okay, Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll be behind the scenes. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Chris. So welcome everybody to this webinar. It's entitled China 2020, the Biotech Boom, Market Opportunities, and the Impact of the Coronavirus. I serve on the board of directors for Mass Bio, and I've worked closely with John Hallinan, who you'll hear from in a moment. And we thought that this was a timely opportunity to talk about China. We've really seen an evolution in the last few years from the increase of investment into the private biotech sector to the regulatory reforms and the financial flexibility to be able to, take a company early stage on the Hong Kong exchange. We've seen also the advent of, trade discussions and geopolitical environment shifting. And now we're here facing COVID. And so what this great panel that you'll hear from on this webinar is going to speak about is really, where are we today? Where have we come from? What do things look like today? And what does the future look like? And I think you've really got all the experts you need to talk about this. And with that, I'll turn it over to John Hallinan, the Chief Business Officer for Mass Bio.
Thanks, Chris. John Hallinan, I am the Chief Business Officer at Mass Bio for the past 6-7 years. Before that, 20 years in industry. And I've had a front row seat to the evolution of biotech, not only in the US, but abroad. And what I'd like to do is introduce or have each member of this distinguished panel give a brief bio. And Chris, Chris Garabedian, turn it back over to you and give us an in-depth bio.
Great. Yes, I'm here today to represent kind of the U.S. biotech perspective and how U.S. biotechs think about China. I run an accelerator called Zontogeny based in Boston. We incubate and seed early stage biotechs. I also run the venture fund for Perceptive Advisors, where we make Series A investments that are more sizable to advance programs into the clinic and through clinical development. And our portfolio, we're always thinking about what is the right China strategy. Happy to be here.
And Hanlon? Oh, Hanlon, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Or good early morning, depends where you register this meeting. My name is Hanlan Liu. I'm working at the KSQ Therapeutics located at Cambridge, Massachusetts. As Chris mentioned, probably more representing the small biotech and research among the panelists. KSQ Therapeutics is a CRISPR-based biotechnology company. I'm the Vice President, Head of Drug Metabolism, Pharmacokinetics, and Preformulation. My main responsibility is to enable small molecule, large molecule, and cell therapy drug discovery programs in the broad area of drug disposition and guide the portfolio into and through clinical trial. As many others in the small biotech, I'm also wearing other hats, start to cover clinical pharmacology, and assist Chief Business Officer in business development activities. I've been working in the big pharma, large and small biotech, including Otsuka, Wyeth, Genzyme, Sanofi, and Catalyzing for more than 20 years, involved 30+ discovery projects, mainly in the rare genetic diseases, including lysosome storage disease disorders, polycystic kidney disease, neuromuscular disorders, and cystic fibrosis, as well as oncology and immunology in my current role, several of which advanced into clinical trial and few got the market approval. Very happy to be here.
And Brad?
Great. So, hello everyone. I'm Brad Lonkar. I'm coming to you today from my home in the Midwest in Kansas City. I'm a biotech investor, and I also create exchange-traded funds, ETFs. And I've created one that focuses on this topic. It's NASDAQ listed, and it's called the China Biopharma ETF. And so to be able to construct that, my job is to be an expert on the topic. So over the last few years, I've traveled to China over 10 times and visited a lot of companies and attended conferences and things. And I'm happy to share with you today some of the things I've learned and why I think this is such an important topic for our industry. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks, Brad. Pei, can you provide a bio?
Yeah, sure. I'm Pei Ziang. I head the Open Innovation Centers for Bayer in China and APAC. My team is responsible for looking for collaboration opportunities with external partners in the Asia Pacific region. So I've worked some time in Boston and then moved back to Singapore, where I'm originally from, where I work for the Singapore government, and then joined Bayer, where now I'm based in China. So I'm really happy to be here.
John Euler?
Hello, I'm the CEO and one of the founders of Beijing. We're an oncology company that has roughly 3,700 folks, and we're operating on 4 continents. We're very present in China, where the majority of our folks are, and have built a unique clinical set of capabilities and are operating clinical trials globally. So part of the perspective I think I'm hoping to bring is, what we're actually seeing, on the ground across the world.
Okay, thanks to all the panelists. First, I'd like to start off by figuring out how we got here, and I'll lead with Brad. And Brad, I'm old enough to remember when President Richard Nixon visited China in the early 70s, and he started the relationship. And since that time, we've seen China evolve from an agrarian economy to a global superpower. And another milestone is when you launched the ETF. So maybe you could tell us, how did we get here?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great transition point, because you talked about how the Chinese economy transitioned to that. We're going through the next transition today. So China is having a biotech moment. There's really something special brewing there, I think. And I think this is a great forum to talk about it, because what's happening in China is of global importance to our industry. Healthcare and health has no borders, and companies today are, really work together and collaborate more than ever, and ours is really a global industry. So even if you don't know about what's happening in China, you really need to, because it's going to affect all of us. So there's a handful of things that are really incubating China's biotech sector. I call it a perfect storm of changes. And I really think the inflection point was 2017. Now, I know this is the result of a lot of work of people on the ground, but some really important things have happened there. So what are the main things that are really catalyzing the biotech sector in China? Well, one of them is government support. So China has a program, for example, called Made in China 2025. And what that's about is shifting the economy to the next level. Think of how the trade war has affected China, and think of how they're trying to take this middle class that they've grown and take it to the next level. How you do that is you shift the economy to these new economy type sectors. So Made in China 2025, they've highlighted about a dozen industries of focus. So these are things like tech and clean tech, and pharmaceuticals is one of those. There's another government program called Healthy China 2030. And that program, they've highlighted 15 goals to reach between now and then. And it's things like reducing the smoking rate. And that's a very important government program, because it means for public policy over this decade, healthcare is always going to be something that's front and center of everything, of all decisions. So government support is a big thing. And for those who have traveled there, or those who work there, they'll know, you'll see a lot of, biotech incubators and campuses that have a lot of government support. So that's a really important thing. Another important key element to this transformation is regulatory reform. So if you're not familiar with it, there's a really important global organization called ICH that was founded by US FDA, the EMA, and the Japanese regulators. And the goal of ICH is to harmonize regulatory standards in drug development and for drug regulation. China became a full member of ICH in 2017. And that's super important because it means to develop a drug in China today, you're essentially using the same playbook that others around the world are. So for example, if you want to file an IND in the United States and you want to file an IND in China, for the most part, all of the preclinical work that you do, the tox, etc., is now all the same. Even the application that you file is the exact same application, just in a different language. So now Chinese companies are speaking the same language that we in the West have been speaking in terms of regulatory standards. The China FDA, which is now called the National Medical Products Administration, has grown a lot and has been professionalized and really revamped over the last handful of years. They've brought a lot of expertise from people who have worked at US FDA and other places. And they've instituted things that we kind of take for granted: priority review, accelerated approvals. INDs get approved in 60 days. Believe it or not, years ago, INDs could take years in some cases. So their FDA is becoming more professional and more efficient. So of course, that's something that's very important. Another thing that, of course, is very important for our industry is payers. If you can't get paid for drugs, how do you have a world-class biotech sector? So China has something called the National Reimbursement Drug List. You might have heard of that. It's very, very famous and very important for succeeding in China. That's the scheme where the government helps pay for drugs. And in the past, that used to get updated very infrequently. There were literally times when that NRDL was not updated for 7 or 8 years. And starting in 2017, it now is updated annually. And so that's a really important change. And new era medicines, things we take for granted like PD-1s are being put on that list. So today's drugs are getting reimbursed in China. As an investor, a thing that's very important to me, but something that's important, I think, to our whole industry is also the stock market reforms. So until 2 years ago, if you were a biotech company that was not revenue or profit generating, you couldn't even list on the stock exchanges there. So the first exchange that changed that rule is the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. In fact, the 2-year anniversary of their change was April 30th. So they, just like the government, recognize that it's these new economy industries that are really going to provide the growth going forward. The Hong Kong Stock Exchange saw the same thing, and they created something that we call the Biotech Rule, that for the first time allows non-revenue and non-profit generating, so R&D focused biotech companies to list on the exchange. So I think that's been a success. There's already been over a dozen companies, and they have a healthy pipeline of ones that are signed up and ready to go this year. And so they have now a listing environment. And I'm a big believer that if you don't have a stock exchange for a biotech sector, you're not going to have a biotech sector. So that was very important. The local stock exchange in mainland China also instituted something like that. They have something now called the Star Market. This is literally a project of the president there. And the idea of the Star Market is to allow tech and biotech companies to list. And they kind of call it their NASDAQ. That's what they aspire to be. And so that's another listing venue for biotech companies. And then, you know, most importantly, I think, is you have all this great science happening. You know, you have entrepreneurs returning home from China and starting world-class companies that are conducting world-class science. The most basic way, I think, to describe the importance of the change there is, until a few years ago, the China's pharmaceutical sector was essentially all generics. You know, it would take many, many years for innovative drugs to reach there. And it was really a generics market. And now we're transitioning to an innovation-based market. And it's really these entrepreneurs and great scientists who are making that happen. So, you know, I like to say all of these elements that I've described, the government support, the regulatory reform, stock market, all of this, you know, if one or two of these things was happening, I would be interested and intrigued and like paying close attention. But the fact that all of them are happening at the same time, I think is really special. I kind of call it the perfect storm. And to me as an investor, I really think it's, the opportunity is similar to, you know, if somebody said, would you go back, if you could, would you go back in time and invest in Genentech and Amgen and Gilead when they were new IPOs and the biotech sector was taking off here in the United States? I think that's essentially what is happening there. I think there's a Gilead, an Amgen, a Celgene in China, and not everyone has heard of them yet, but you will one day. And lastly, what I would say is think of the tech sector and how that's grown in China. You know, a couple decades ago, you had a lot of people who returned from Silicon Valley and Boston and our other tech areas in the United States and saw how that happened. And they started companies like Alibaba and Tencent, companies that are now world-class innovators and household names all around the world. I really think that's what's going on. We're in the very beginning of that in biotech. So do you think of it from that viewpoint, that it's the start? You know, not everything is in place, not everything is perfect, but we're in the very start of something that could be an important long-term trend. I think it's something that everyone really has to focus on. So this is what excited me coming into 2020. You know, I've been focused on this and excited about it for years as I've seen all of these things start to change. And so that's kind of where we were. The sector had a lot of momentum. So maybe, John, I'll kick it back to you. And I know a lot of our panelists will talk about, you know, the present, you know, now what happens going forward?
Thanks, Brad. And one follow-up question, for all the US companies that are looking to the China market, which is really large, what does the China market mean to biotech companies in the US and elsewhere? And what is the Chinese market looking for from those companies?
Yeah, so first of all, China's already the second largest market for pharmaceuticals in the world. And I would focus on two things, and these are really the two things that are causing multinationals to really focus on it, especially over the last year. The first is just the transition to innovation. You know, if you were an innovative R&D-based drug maker, it would take you many, many years to get your new drug on the market there. And now that's changing. Now China is actually inviting companies to submit applications to get their drugs approved in the country. They've literally published lists. You know, these are the things we want. So that's an important change. Another thing that's very important is a little over a year ago, China started to accept data, foreign clinical trial data, as the basis of some approvals, especially in cases where there were high unmet needs. So if you couple that with the fact that they joined ICH, and now the way that you develop a drug in China is the same that you do in the United States, I think that there's a lot more opportunities, and multinational companies just have a better understanding of the rules of the game there. And so a lot of red tape has been taken away. And so everybody's jumping in because everyone, I think, saw the importance of the market. Now you're transitioning to innovation, and you're allowing more foreign trial data, and you're providing people with a better understanding of what it takes to develop a drug within the country. So it's just a much, it's a process that's much more relatable and understandable for foreign companies.
Thanks, Brad. One last question. We have many Chinese American friends in industry, and I understand that in China, you are known as an American Chinese. How can the rest of us join this nationality?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, it's a little difficult in these times. I'm a big believer in getting on an airplane and visiting people. Like I said, I've been there 10 times over the last few years. And, you know, it's, to me, it's one of these places where it's hard to articulate this. You can just kind of feel the growth. So like, say 70% of pharmaceutical companies are in the Shanghai area. There's a lot in Beijing and some other places as well, but they actually have an area there that's very analogous to Boston and Cambridge, where you walk down the street and it's just like biotech company after biotech company. And sometimes I'll return just after 3 or 4 months and, you know, there's literally a new building or a new company. You just kind of feel that excitement and that growth. And it's a lot of fun to see it. So hopefully one day, you know, we'll be back to somewhat normalcy. And my biggest piece of advice is to see it for yourself, because it is actually hard to articulate unless you've been on the ground and met the people. But it's a lot of fun and it's very impressive. The science that's happening there is really world class, and you know, the people that are making it happen are great people and great members of our global biotech community. So if you get the chance to go there one day in the future, definitely do that. You know, go for a conference and stay a few days after, and you can hit dozens of biotech companies in one day, because many of them are in one area there.
Thanks, Brad. So I'd like to shift to the present day and talk about what are the facts on the ground. And so I would like to bring Pei and John and Hanlon into the dialogue, and maybe we can start with Pei. Can you provide your perspective and tell us what's happening on the ground today?
Yeah, I think that I agree. I guess, you know, for Bayer, actually, we've been in China for doing collaborations with the university for about 10 years now. We have strategic collaborations with both Peking and Tsinghua universities. And I think that it's recognized, right, throughout the world in terms of their growth in publications, that their basic science is on par with the rest of the world. I think in the last 2 or 3 years, the people that we're working with have also started their own companies. And I'm happy to say that, you know, being through our collaborations, what we have helped is to not only help them improve their platforms, but also help to validate some of their platforms through some of these collaborations, and gives them confidence then to start off companies. And then some of our collaborations then carry on to these companies. So I think that especially with the flash of funding, and as Brad mentioned, I mean, returnees, and you know, they have a strong base of CRO companies. They've of course then moved up the ladder, and there's a growth of biotech companies. And of course, academics like, you know, founder Professor Xiaodong Wang, founder of Beijing, or Professor Yigong Shi, who is the founder of Biopharma. I mean, they have shown the way, right? And they have inspired academia to see that, you know, we can be successful in starting our companies as well. So I think you do see that there are more investigators coming out of the universities and starting their companies. And I also say that the Chinese VCs are also very aggressive, right? So they look at who are the top academic investigators, and then they go to the universities and ask them and say, hey, I help you start a company. So I think all that is made possible by the talent, but also the funding, right? And I think that, you know, science and innovation, these are like 3 pieces that help to build an ecosystem. So that's where I think it's starting to take off.
And John Euler, we see China getting back to work. And so would like to hear your perspective on that, because certainly in the US. I think many in the industry and in other sectors would like to return to work. And also very interested because you started a global biopharma company, which really has roots in China. You have 7 offices around the world, but no headquarters. So you have a very unique perspective. And I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you. So yeah, maybe I'll work my way backwards. Yeah, Beijing, we're a company that actually has really talked about being headquarter-less. You know, part of our view was, you know, in the new world as things are emerging, for a biotech company, we believe that, you know, you have to be working globally. And there's different ways to do that, but we think it's really important. And I think that ties back to some of the things that Brad said. The first thing that Brad said was, you know, that I think is very, very important is, you know, clinical trials have, you know, changed regulation to enable one trial really to be run for global registration. This is not the way things were 3 years ago. And I think my co-founder Xiaodong and I saw this coming. And, you know, fundamentally, this addresses the biggest issue in our industry, which isn't, does science work? Science works. It does. It's working tremendously. We're having huge impact on cancer patients. The industry, it's remarkable what has happened in the last 10 years since we started our company. Just the industry, it's unbelievable. It surpasses everyone's expectations. But the issue really is about affordability. And we need to be more affordable in the US, but we also need to be more affordable because in our industry, 90% of the time and 90% of the cost is in clinical trials. And, you know, what we understood was there's as many new incidences of cancer in China as in all the countries where we traditionally run clinical trials. And in the US, I think Rick Pazder said 5% of patients are willing to be on a clinical trial pretty consistently for the last 20 years. And from our perspective in China, that might be as high as 50% of patients are willing to be on a trial. So you're doubling the size of patients that can enroll. And if they're willing to enroll at a greater rate, it might be, you know, 3, 5, even more times as many patients. And this is the single biggest bottleneck. Well, it makes not only innovation get to patients more quickly globally, but it also enables you to be much lower cost. Because if a trial that took 4 years and required 300 centers suddenly can be run in a year shorter time frame and have, you know, 2/3 as many centers, because the centers are bigger in China, it lowers the cost too. And that can enable us to make things more affordable. The second point that Brad made was around reimbursement. China reimbursing drugs really did also change the game. AstraZeneca's first quarter numbers, for every $1 of revenue they do 68 cents today in China. It's remarkable. And, you know, in our industry, the costs are predominantly upfront. So the vast majority of that, you know, is a gross margin number. And, you know, the prices are dramatically lower, but the contribution to innovation, it's a huge new source of funding to fund all of us for innovation is the revenue from China. And we do believe those two changes really impact everything, but it means you have to be global. And if you're making an innovation, if you have an impactful drug and you can only bring it to market in the US and you can't bring it to market in China, or you can only bring it to market in China and you can't bring it in the US, you can't get to the other places in the world. You're trying to cover that cost of innovation by too few people. So we see a world where billions of patients, not a billion of people can afford drugs, billions, not just really the wealthiest billion. And we think that's a world with much more affordable drugs. So we're really excited, and we think that these changes have enabled that. And I think that's what Brad was talking about. In terms of what we're seeing today on the ground in China, I think that vision, you know, that data from AstraZeneca, it's real. I think we've been able to see in the many trials we're running, we have a clinical team that's over 1,200 people. We have, I don't know, it's 50, 60, probably maybe more trials running over the course of the last few years. And we're running those in 30 countries. From that perspective, you know, China is a big contributor. We've been able to run trials more quickly, and we've been able to do that at global quality. And the data has been, you know, inspected and looked at by US FDA, and it's been acceptable. So I think that vision is real and it's true. And I think that's a wave of the future. The way we chose to do it, John, to your point, is we believed philosophically when a company says, I have a headquarters, I'm a Boston company, or I'm a German company, or I'm a San Francisco company, everybody else, everywhere else in the world feels like a second-class citizen. So when we started our company, Brad, I have flown a lot in my life, a whole lot in my life. And I believe the same thing. Being with people is wonderful and it's great. And you get on a plane and you go. I go. And when we started, we said, we're going to be headquartered on United. And within the last several years, we switched and said, no, we're going to be headquartered on Zoom, because Zoom is good. And there's a way to work that is very different now. And we really, really embrace that. So, to us, this is in many ways, actually, the only thing that changed is internally we're doing things the same, but externally we're able to interact with people in a very different way. In terms of our experiences, it's remarkable, but we have, not had people in China that were affected or their families at all. But we have lots of people in the US and people in Europe that have been. In terms of what's happening today in China, all of our offices, have been reopened. They opened over time. We were probably on the cutting edge of closing offices in China. We do have an office in Wuhan, and we closed very early, but we're all open again. And from that perspective, with the clinical trials we're running, I think about 80% of the sites are enrolling and open for new patients, which is remarkable. And I think from that perspective, 70% of the sites we can send in, CRAs to do site monitoring at this point, and things are in pretty good shape from that perspective. Comparing that to globally, I think there were complete shutdowns in China for a month and a half. In the rest of the world, we've been remarkably surprised too at how people have been able to maintain, patients coming and doing site visits, even in hotspots. So the clinical trial disruption, I think in general, has been a lot less. In the general course of business, I'd say we're at least 90% back, functionally across China in our offices and in everything we're doing. And actually, we're having business interactions with people that involve dinners and lunches, and restaurants are, not at full capacity, but when you go there, they certainly don't feel empty anymore at this point. So I do think that, things are getting back to normal there. I think the other thing that we have seen is companies in the United States who have been working in some of the hotspot areas that are worried that some of their trials are at risk, trying to see if they can open some additional sites, other places in the world, of which China is one, to kind of hedge that risk and make sure, if there's any issues continuing to enroll patients, say they're a heavy enroller in New York or New Jersey, then, maybe they want to find a backup plan. And we've seen, an interest and effort in doing a lot of things from that perspective. I think the last thing that I would say is the most remarkable thing we've seen everywhere is this industry, get together and form collaborations and be open with each other. And in general, almost without exception, every interaction that I've seen or been involved with, people have come and said, we're not interested in doing this for profitability. We have to do this because it's fit with our mission, it's fit with our purpose. Let's find a way to work together. And, you see a collaboration of 3 or 4 companies trying to do something together, ask a question, investing money that is not at all in line with any NPV. It's just, we need to do this together. We need to work together. We need to do the right thing. And, that's while they're facing the stress with their families and dealing with a very different situation, with the loss of people they know. It's unbelievably remarkable and inspiring to see that within our industry. And, it really, touches you and makes you really proud. So I think that's been truly remarkable.
Thanks, John. Hanlon, to John's point about collaboration, you have led scientific teams in both large global pharma companies and more recently smaller Kendall Square-based companies, and would love to get your perspective on collaboration between the US and China, and also understanding that you have a background in Wuhan and just your personal experience and what you're hearing from your friends and family in Wuhan.
Yeah, certainly I'm happy to share. Maybe if you don't mind, maybe talk my personal kind of a story first, and then after that share with you in terms of, as a small biotech, how we still continue work with the China CL network, and then continue advance in terms of portfolio, and what we're looking for in terms of China collaboration with my perspective a little bit maybe later on. So one of the actually primary reasons I'm sitting here is where I came from. Wuhan actually is my hometown. The letter, my Han, actually same as my first letter of my first name, Hanlan, Han. I was born there, grew up there, and went to Wuhan University. Some of you maybe visited there already for both undergraduate and graduate school in biochemistry and molecular biology. In 1993, probably that's the dividing line, I came to the United States with Mike Knight Foundation for fellowship and then obtained my PhD. As of now, 99% of my relatives, including my parents at the age of 89 and 85, brothers and their families and certain extended relatives have been living in the city almost their entire lives. I think at this time, you all know COVID-19 epidemics in that city. There might be different versions, and the things at that time I was not at the city, so I'm not here to judge the degree of truthness of one version versus the other. However, I can say something about my family relatives, my classmates from elementary school, middle school, high school, college, their families, my teachers, and neighbors of my relatives, probably a couple of hundreds in the very different regions of this very big city by this time, you probably know. All of them, I have to say, lived through this quarantine period, started from January 23rd at 10 p.m. through April 8th, unprecedented in the history of the whole world for a 9 million people city, with the exception of one person. This is again from my story over here is, who is the father of my high school classmate? Due to the collapse of the healthcare system at the city in early February, his father died in home due to a minor disease not to relate to COVID-19 at all. That is a tragedy because his father also used to be a dean of my high school. This is certainly a person lost to me. Now, but the city is on the way to full openness. All my relatives, certainly not my parents, they retired more than 20 years ago from the railway industry, probably the most biggest railway hub in China, the largest one. They all gone back to work, though they must follow a new way of hygiene. Maybe you know, all of you know, like wearing the mask, and also carry with them the healthy code while going out. Some of my friends start to complain, like traffic in the city. If you imagine the quarantine for so long, empty streets, now they complain about the traffic. And also past week, so-called May 1st Golden Week break, my friend's family already in Wuhan were traveling around. They share with me their pictures. So to me, that's a really real what happened, as John mentioned about in terms of his big company clinical trials, and then his office in Wuhan in terms back to work. So this is really from the ground in terms of, my relatives, my friends, now living in Wuhan, what their life look like as well. So certainly I'm very happy as a person to see, what's happening in that city, because you can see how my deep root connection with that city and with the people, with my parents and all the others living over there. And then the second one in terms, right now, in terms of here as a small biotech, as a researcher on collaboration, certainly my network over here, working in the China at the moment too. So from our CRO work, I say there are some disruptions certainly, but very short, because that's coincidence with the Chinese New Year break. So in a way, we're a little bit lucky because there are 2 weeks that's expected. We know China going to have a shutdown. But because this epidemic, that extended a little bit, I think 2 more weeks or 3 more weeks. And at the moment now, I can see all of CROs, half a dozen in 4 different areas, Nanjing, Ningbo, Shanghai, and Suzhou, they're all fully operational. Because we work on the drug discovery, we have certain turnaround time, and then they are meeting those turnaround time and beating those time as well too. So in that regard, we're lucky in terms of working with the CROs in China. So even though over here, the operation got disrupted a little bit, but actually our China CRO caught up. And then we're very happy on that, and actually really moving some of our programs further. For instance, right now we're in the candidate nomination stage, and for the other project, we're really in the cell line development stage at that kind of stage as well too, because of the work we're working with our CRO. Maybe I will add a little bit. Certainly you can see my route and also my work here. Many of my friends and used to work over here returned back to China too. And then from the last couple of weeks talking with them, and many of their companies as entrepreneur or as executive as CROs, or even in the China pharma industry themselves as well. And then seems they're all back to operational, not full extent, but certainly over half, 50% or even more than that. So that's kind of my view. Thank you again to include me to share with you my perspective and stories.
Well, thank you, Hanlin. And I'd like to transition a little bit now to the future. I think what my takeaway is that there's tremendous opportunity. And Chris Garabedian, you have led companies on the West Coast, East Coast. You're on the MassBio board. You created a visionary new company, biotech aggregator with ontogeny. And how does China fit within all of that? You have a unique perspective. I'm sure you've crisscrossed the globe a number of times. And so maybe you could key us in as to where this is all headed.
Yeah, thanks, John. And let me remind people, we have allocated time for Q&A at the end. And we forgot to mention up front, there is a Q&A box. If you have any questions for any of the panelists or all of us, please put your questions in the Q&A box. Yeah, this talk about China brings me back to when I was head of corporate strategy at Celgene, and we acquired Abraxis Biosciences back in 2010 and 2009, 2010, and they had approval of Abraxane in China, and were able to command a premium price for that drug going back to 2009. And when we acquired Abraxis, we used that foundation to establish a presence and a headquarters in China. Now that's going back 10 years ago. And at that time, if you were to think the typical biotech mentality, especially a cash-strapped biotech, we've had quite a run the last 8 years or so where cash has not been a problem, but that hasn't always been the case. There were biotechs who even questioned, do we even file a patent in China, right? Patent busting strategies, all of that, but it wasn't perceived to be a sizable market. Why bother, right? And that has changed tremendously over the last 10 years, particularly as Brad mentioned, since 2017. And I think as I work with a lot of early stage biotechs and think about emerging biotech strategies, it really comes down to the uncertainty has been reduced significantly. And this goes to uncertainty about regulatory, right, pathways. And China, being, joining the IHC and having harmonization of regulatory guidelines brings an understanding, right, of what is the likely expectation to get a drug approved. And I think that now that biotechs have more of an understanding of that, that has been coupled with the national reimbursement drug list and the fact that they've kind of caught up with any delays or any evaluations of those drugs. And so now there's less uncertainty around how do you get on that reimbursement drug list. And there's a better understanding of what kind of price you could command and how to calculate what the market potential is. And so I think for a lot of biotechs, these uncertainties now make it very attractive to figure out a China strategy. Now that could go a couple ways, right? One is, and I think Pei may have mentioned this earlier, the CROs, and Hanlin has worked with CROs. The CROs have matured in China, and not just, we all know WuXi and how successful WuXi's been, but the clinical CROs have also, right, matured. Now, I would say that, a biotech company still has to do their diligence around the CROs, right? the benches aren't as deep, right? When you go to a IQVIA or a Covance or, you know, a Par XL or PPD in the US, I mean, you know, you might get the B team or the C team, but, you know, they're pretty capable, have a deep experience of, you know, running clinical trials. And there are very capable CROs in China, but I think the benches aren't quite as deep yet with that experience. And so I think biotechs really, they still have some uncertainty. Are we sure we can do this ourselves? Can we do this? And John Euler is going to have a much better sense of that and have a pulse on that. But what I would say is that I think biotechs are either thinking, is there a multinational pharma licensing strategy with their companies, right? But also more of them are thinking, is this something we can do ourselves? I mean, Celgene made that decision 10 years ago. And I think that for a lot of biotechs, you know, it's not something where they feel that we don't have the 20 years experience at other companies. This is a fairly new, right, phenomenon that even, you know, capable biotechs can really consider a China strategy. And so kind of that's what I've seen. And as I look at our portfolio, most of them are earlier in development. We think that once we have clinical proof of concept data or are in an attractive market that's in the clinic, that has a value. And so I think that's how we look at it. I think the one area that we still don't have a lot of precedent data is how successful can commercial products be, and what are the appropriate economics, right, for, let's say, a licensing deal, right? You know, the royalties, you know, the milestone payments, you know, this is difficult when you're outside of these well-characterized, you know, markets that have been around where, you know, you can look at a disease area and you know exactly what the market size is and how much someone can charge. And so that's where I think from a business development standpoint, you know, there's still probably an evolution that needs to take place there. But that's my perspective from a kind of a US biotech standpoint.
Yeah, it sounds like China has clearly become a key player in, unlike the origins of the industry where all the biotech companies were in Boston or San Francisco, now there is a global supply chain and China is really key to that. And do you see that changing as a result of the pandemic, or is this definitely part of the new model that we're going to see going forward? And I would like each of the panelists to talk about that.
Yeah, I'll go first. I mean, I think that it's interesting, right? Work streams and continuity of business, right? Everybody during this COVID crisis is putting that at the top of the list, right? How do we keep the program moving forward? How do we use our balance sheet? And honestly, it's wherever we can get it done. And so if China gets up and running and their CROs are running, you know, seamlessly, you may see a shift where, I'll be honest, a year ago, with the trade, you know, environment, people were starting to, well, maybe we shouldn't go with WuXi. What if something happens, right? And I think at this point, people are really trying to understand, you know, how can we use China and their ecosystem, right, to facilitate. And, you know, there's been some constraints around non-human primates. And, you know, those costs have been going up. Well, you know, if you can have a China CRO who has, you know, the capability to do that, well, any biotech's going to say, let's go with it. So I think that's how it's changed. And I know the other panelists have comments, but Brad, you've done a lot in the immuno-oncology space, and, you know, that's a very different business model, but I know you've had some experience as it relates to China on that as well, if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, well, I think that for sure, I don't think cooperation and using CROs is going to go away. In fact, I think it's going to grow because companies are much more virtual, as you've described. I do think one thing we have to be careful about as a global industry is biotech is getting dragged into politics due to COVID-19. And there's a lot of nationalism and I think a lot of protectionism that's going to come. And so I do think there's going to be, you know, there's going to be a lot more local manufacturing. And just, I think that companies in our industry are likely going to need to have more facilities in the actual geographies that they're doing businesses. the US, without a doubt, will have some legislation that I think has like a Buy America clause, and that also incentivizes companies to do drug manufacturing in the US. And I think Europe will do similar things. And I think that some things like that will happen in Asia too. And so I think we need to be careful as an industry over the coming years, because biotech and science in general is all about sharing and collaborating and working together. And I concerned that that's not going to be the mentality of governments going forward. And so I think it's on us as an industry to really voice our views around the world and really explain why it's so important for health and humanity that we don't get overly protective of this industry, because we're already seeing some signs of that. Of course, we're in the heat of the moment right now, but how that plays out over the coming years can take a few directions. And maybe I'll pass that over to John Euler. I'm sure he has a lot of thoughts about that.
Sure, I'd share a few. I think it's very true, just given what's happened in the last year or so. I think unquestionably, manufacturing is something that, you're probably going to need to think about, manufacturing, lots of places, not just one, which is, suboptimal in some ways, but it's probably okay. But I think that is a strategic thing that, it's very clear to us. We want to be manufacturing places we're commercializing, and more than one. And we're doing that with everything we do. Our BTK inhibitors, manufactured by Catalent in the US, for example. From that perspective, though, I think that the rest of the industry, the reason that we've hit our stride is we're so much better because there's immediate access to information. AACR, ASCO, immediately scientists everywhere. It's not an elite club anymore. You get the information, they can work on things, we can build on things. It is the collaborations with academic institutions across the world, with companies across the world, that's made everything work in a better system than it has before. And we're better, we're faster, we're lower cost than we've ever been because of this collaboration, largely in research. The clinical piece is really just coming together now. And, Chris, everything we're doing in China, for the most part is in-house. We're not using CROs. The reason is the talent pool is just too small right now. The promise is there. And, building the capabilities, it'll take 5 years. In 5 years, the quality will be there everywhere. But right now it's a smaller pool. So, we want to amass as much as we can. And I think the B team in China, probably is not as good as the B team, in the rest of the world for most CROs. And the B team's never that great. So, I do think from this perspective, it's harder. I also think that the relationships you have with the KOLs at the important and big and best hospitals enable whether your trial is going to be run there or someone else's. And I think it's much easier for a company like us to build those relationships than it is, for a CRO that's working for 20 different people, all of whom want to get into that center and work with that KOL to run a trial. So I think there's some considerations there, but over time, those will rectify as the skills get better and better about how to do work. We still think it's hard and it's limited to get the global quality. And that's why we're building everything ourselves to ensure that quality. I think from the, but the promise is there and it's going to happen. And the only thing that could derail that is, a government intervention that makes it much harder, to access this. The reason it matters, again, it's just about medicine being affordable. We bankrupt families in the US right now with the cost of medicines, not because we're bad people, but because to pay for the innovation that's necessary, that's the way the math works out. And I think the same is true. A lot of the medicines, they're not affordable in most countries in the world. So the use is smaller of a wonderful thing that's developed. And I think that to the degree we can, have much, much broader access, even if the price point's substantially lower, the value's there for the industry that still continues to support innovation. no one in the world thought 10 years ago when we started our company that AstraZeneca would make 68 cents in China for every dollar of revenue that it makes in the United States. No one, and it's there and it's growing. And so the possibility is really there. And I think that this will help the industry move to a model where we can, be just as profitable, invest just as much in innovation, get medicines to patients even faster, but change our image because medicine will be much more affordable in the US and in other places. So I think that while there is friction, no government doesn't want affordable medicine. So I do think there's two counter forces. There is a sense of nationalism and isolation. But if there's ever an area in which the world can get together and agree that we have a unified global enemy, it should be fighting disease. And cancer is a terrible disease, and this is exactly what those people who believe that the world working together towards the critical challenges that the human race faces should unify around. And I think that we're doing that. And I love the people in this industry, and I think that there's so many people doing this for all the right reasons. And you can't really argue with this is the way to do it to be affordable. And if we're not affordable, great science is meaningless. So I think that the industry is moving with a lot of forces. Manufacturing will be different. It'll take time to have these clinical capabilities as good as they need to be to make them as easily used as chemistry is today, or something from that perspective. But the winds are behind us, and if you want to sail to paradise, the only way to get there is to work together. So I believe strongly that's the direction we're going. And like everything, we're going to encounter some waves along the road. And what do? You bear down, you work harder, you try to explain why this is useful and it's a value. And I think that we will work our way through this. I mean, the countries and world goes back and forth, but in general, we've always progressed.
Thanks, John. And I'd like to turn it over to Hanlon to expand on this dialogue, and then to Peg.
This to me, John, I just want to make sure you hand over to me.
Yes.
Okay. I think some of your panelists really touch a very good point, like Chris, John, Brad, about China. I'd like to add a little bit more about this affordability, and also as a biotech right now working for very, very innovative medicine, how we're able to work together and bring that to patients a little bit faster. Some of you know, actually majority of my career spent in Genzyme and Sanofi. We work on the rare genetic disease. Affordability, it's almost number one thing we ask, as our CEO, Henry Tamir, worked on this many, many years ago too. This is probably much bigger as you talk about in China as well. There's probably very difficult or no way for China to pay for that price for the innovation that Genzyme decades ago looked into for rare genetic disease, because you have to pay somehow innovation to foster on that as well. So certainly to me, that's a very big thing you mentioned about. I know where I came from, what I've been working my years, and I actually get some drugs already approved or in the critical clinical trial for rare genetic disease. So in terms now, maybe back into this, as right now I'm working with the company on the cell therapy. This is a very innovative, what I see right now, maybe a next wave in terms of medicine for potentially, I would say potentially cure the cancer disease. It's such a hard disease. Many of us are really fighting on, probably all our lives as well. And then think about how we can get to patients a little bit quicker. And also at the end, in terms of affordability as well, many of the touch, because the price tag right now for 2 approved cell therapies. And also, for getting this very personalized medicine to the clinical trial, it's a tremendous, tremendous demanding as well too, for people really knowing that. And from last year, actually a paper published on Nature, both China and the US right now on the top 2 in terms in clinical trial for the cell therapies. Actually, in China, there are more clinical trials for cell therapy than US, but the US certainly have a lot more preclinical researches as well. So I have been really thinking, and also our company started thinking, what is the best way we can actually bring this innovative, what I see potentially cancer cure medicines into the patients, and then to be able to really quickly assess the safety and efficacy in this very demanding personalized medicine is a very, very big challenge for us. Certainly CMC component is as well too. But then looking at also China, you know, we just start to think about, could that be also opportunity as well? Because there are certainly many hospitals over there. They've been already doing clinical trial. We don't know, again, the quality. We don't know how deep their bench, like John and Chris, you mentioned as well too. But certainly there are people working on that. There are a lot. There are many patients as well. And certainly there is a demand. I don't know today what is the best way, but certainly there are some opportunities over there. And I'm sure there are challenges over there too. So this is just back into, you know, how we get innovative medicines to patients. It's not really one country or the other country. I just feel, as John you illustrated, it is our really mission together. As we're working industry, at the end of the day, how we can bring innovative medicines to treat the patients who are devastating status. There's unmet medical needs. There's no therapeutic moment as well. So that's my current thought. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Hanlin. And certainly there's a great opportunity. Unmet medical need around the world is growing. So we're going to need some collaboration. And Pei, I would like you to comment.
Yeah, but I think in terms of early collaboration, I think it will continue because, I mean, it's hard, right? Early collaboration, you know, getting to a drug, I mean, that's really long road. So I think that in terms of exchange between academia, I don't really think that will stop under different circumstances or whatever circumstances we have now. I do agree that in terms of CRO activity in the near term, actually, you might see a lot more in China because, you know, other places, for example, in Europe, it's being impacted because of the lockdown or, you know, stop in work. Whereas in China, they're really quickly getting back onto their feet. In fact, they're trying to rush to meet the timelines. So I think in the short term, definitely for CRO activity, we would see more, and we'll see companies looking for backup options in China because they're already back to work. I do agree, of course, with the other panelists in terms of manufacturing. There's a need for companies to think about how they would diversify their manufacturing activities. But yeah, I think that's something that, you know, because of the COVID, everybody has to think about, not particular to, you know, China-US or relations, but in general because of the academic, right? So yeah.
Thank you, Pei. Chris Gerbedian. Certainly from a MassBio board perspective, you and I have talked a lot about the Mass cluster right now. No matter where we travel in the world, companies of every size are looking to interface with Massachusetts and MassBio. We are considered the top biomedical cluster, at least in the US. It sounds like with the emerging skill set, innovation, and science and capital in China, China is going to be in that same place. Do companies need to have a presence in China?
Yeah, you know, I think it's almost similar today to saying, well, does a company need to think about a European strategy or do they need a presence in Europe, right? There's always a choice. Do you want to outsource that, you know, through a deal to let somebody who's got expertise, or do you build it or hire it yourself? And I think one of the things that, you know, John Euler kind of highlighted and Brad highlighted in terms of this need for collaboration, what you're really seeing is, you know, Chinese Americans who have grown up in our biotech industry or had pharma positions, right, who understand China and who in some cases have worked in pharma to lead, you know, China as a general manager, et cetera. Well, now you're seeing, you know, how can we recruit, right? There's a interest in talent, right, that can translate the discipline, right, the functional discipline expertise to play in China. And so I think I see it at the entrepreneur level, where you have people who are establishing labs in China as an entrepreneur, but they've spent most of their career in US biotechs. On the investment side, I think one of the things that we've seen over the last couple of years is some of the China investment has been insular, right? You see these, Chinese syndicate investments, and they get great valuations, and they go on the, on the exchanges, and they haven't brought in the U.S. institutional investors. And so what I'm seeing, representing as an investment side now, is that they'd like to collaborate with reputable U.S. institutional investors earlier, whether that be in early private rounds or in IPO, pre-IPO crossover rounds. But the earlier they can get as part of a syndicate a shared China and U.S. investor strategy, the better off they're going to be. And we're seeing it on the talent side. I mean, having been at Gilead and Celgene during a lot of their growth years and their build outs, if we didn't have an expertise, we're like, who can we hire that has that expertise and we can incorporate them into our company? And there's no reason any biotech out there can't think about that themselves, right? There's already a scarcity of talent and a, kind of a hunt for the best talent. And that's expanding now to China. And so I think, Mass Bio, if you think about good science, you can find almost anywhere. There's great institutions, around the world, you can find good science. The two big pinch points are drug development, right? And commercialization expertise. That's a more unique talent, right? And, financial, right, capacity. And, those two things, I think, are starting to figure out and come together. And I think a lot of them come to the hubs, and, Boston, Cambridge has really become an important part of that. And I think why Mass Bio is interested in this topic and why we want to continue to maintain kind of a leadership and understanding what these dynamics are.
Thanks, Chris. A couple questions from the audience. This one directed to Brad. Can you please speak more to the key areas of innovation and investment prioritized by the Chinese government that you covered? Are those areas of focus universal globally, or are some aspects unique to the Chinese market?
Well, without a doubt, the biggest one is oncology. And I think there's really two reasons behind that, one of which is global and one of which is local. Globally, just because that's where the most impactful science is happening today with, immuno-oncology and targeted therapies and things. And so I think China wants to be at the forefront of science. So oncology is a great place to do that. Handlin mentioned how there's more cell therapy trials happening in China today than there are in the United States. So oncology is definitely a big one. I'll actually give you a dark horse one to keep an eye on over the coming months is actually vaccines. So China has a very checkered history with vaccines. There's been a couple major scandals. There was a big one 2 years ago. And you've been reading a lot in the news lately about the race to develop a vaccine. One story that's not being told as accurately as it could be in the West is China's actually leading that race in terms of how far they are in developing things. We'll see if they're leading in terms of the science. But China really wants to be the country that has the first successful vaccine to develop. Number one, to really, turn the local mentality, back towards, viewing these things positively because of all of those scandals in the past. And number two, to showcase it in terms of such an important event as we're going on here. But, it's really everything. Another panelist mentioned rare diseases. I mean, that's something, it would be unthinkable to be talking about rare diseases, just as recently as a few years ago. And there are now a lot of companies that are getting in the rare disease space. The scale of China is so huge that, what we consider a rare disease is a pretty huge market. And, that goes back to oncology too. I saw a statistic, John Euler would know this better than I do, but something like literally 1 out of 5 cancer patients in the world is in China. Think about that and how big that is. So, Oncology is a big one, but I think that the focus is really broadening out to all areas of medicine right now. So, yeah.
Okay, another question, and I'll direct this to Pei and to John Euler. Given the theme of global partnerships and collaboration in science, what do you think the greatest opportunities and obstacles are for CRO partnerships between U.S. biopharma firms and Chinese CROs? And we talked a little bit about maybe the B team, but we've certainly seen the skill set greatly increase. So Pei, I would like your comment from the Bayer perspective, and then John.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, because Bayer being a European company, I think we're under much less scrutiny versus if you're a US pharma because of the US. So I think we have had really good experience with the CROs there. Definitely, I think, as everybody mentioned in terms of chemistry, they're really good at that, not just WuXi, but other companies as well. So I think in terms of that will continue. I guess, other panelists have talked about clinical expertise, but definitely in terms of platform technology, I do think that that's their strong suit. Yeah, and we will continue to collaborate with not only like large companies like WuXi, but also companies coming out with different types of platform technologies, especially in the area of chemistry and biologics.
John Euler?
Sure. I will try to provide a little bit of an answer, and then I wanted to address something that Chris had said, if that's okay.
Yes.
I think that the whole concept that CRO is like one thing, I think has always been a funny way of looking at things. Even within a company like WuXi, chemistry is different than biology, which is different than DMPK, which is different than tox. There's different levels of competition and capabilities in all of those ways preclinically. When you move to clinically, the same is true. There's different aspects of it, and each one requires a different skill set, and each one there's different levels of capabilities in every country in the world, and there's some that technology is changing and there's some that they aren't. So I think it's when you ask a broad question that's including all those different functional areas, you really need to think about, for the functional area in which you need help, you need to think about that as, who are the people that have the right capabilities, the skill sets, and, what is those level of capabilities and where should I be doing that in the world? And the fortunate thing is we're in a place where, you can easily do that. I do think, preclinically, in general, the skill sets are very, very good. And that's different than 15 years ago, dramatically different. I think in clinical, it's really early. And to be able to actually run trials that you're going to count on for global registration in every country, I think there's, a very limited amount of talent with the capabilities to do that today. And I think in 5, 10, 15 years, that'll be dramatically different at each of those steps. But it's critical because, there are a huge number of oncology patients in China. They're willing to enroll in trials. And it's critical for the industry to build the skill set because it's going to make our ability to get innovative drugs to patients faster and more affordable. There's a question on this list about more affordable. Is it still more affordable to do trials in China? It's actually, that's the wrong question. Everybody would believe that if you can do a trial in 3 years versus 4 years, it's going to be cheaper. It's going to be cheaper for your patients in Boston. It's cheaper in New York because the trial's a year shorter. And by the way, you have an extra, year of, competitive and, commercial time that's earlier in your NPV calculation. So by all extents, it's critical. Yes, it is cheaper, but it's not necessarily cheaper because costs aren't going up in China. They are, but it's cheaper because you're doing something much more efficiently. In terms of what I wanted to comment to with Chris, when he talked about what do biotech companies need to be doing in China, I think you can't ignore it. And I'll probably say something controversial at the moment, but I'll say it. I don't believe the future has any regional company in it. Not company is the wrong thing. No asset can be regional. If you have a great innovative drug and you can only get it to patients in the US, it's going to be so damn expensive. And someone else is going to come up with a drug similar, and they're going to market it all throughout the world. And they're going to be able to pay for their innovation at a much lower price than you have, because you're only addressing a very, very small fraction of the world's population. Any innovation you're making, it's all upfront cost. Do it the right way so that it can be registered everywhere in the world. Should you commercialize it everywhere in the world? Probably not. Probably not. But from that perspective, you've got to get to all those markets and have them contributing, because I don't believe the price points we're at are sustainable. You know, there's a political headwind. I believe competition is the right way to handle that. I don't believe policy is. But essentially, you know, the price points aren't sustainable, and the way we're going to be able to afford to be, the way we're going to be able to make our business model work successfully as innovators is to make sure that when we make an innovation, we're monetizing it everywhere in the world that we possibly can. That will mean at a lower price point, but it doesn't mean we're not just as profitable and we're not able to innovate it. We will be able to. But if you're one of the companies that doesn't understand that trend, and you wind up tied in one market or two markets and you ignore the others, you're going to be at a big disadvantage. And I think as a biotech company today, you're making a choice that's betting on how's the future going to evolve. No one ever knows how the future evolves. I can't tell you. What I can tell you is in the past, I said the AZ numbers. By the way, AZ is a European company. They did more revenue in China than Europe. Think about that. You can't ignore China. Of course you can. You probably need to have a presence. I don't know what a presence means anymore, but you need to make sure that you're doing things to get active in that market so that you can be monetizing there, so that your overall medicine can be affordable. I think commercially, China is bigger and more complex than the US. In China, the KOLs, the clinicians in the second tier and third tier hospitals, they're not as sophisticated and, you know, pedigreed and well educated and trained and used to things as in the United States yet. That's a skill set that's being built. The teams that need to be built commercially need to be science and medicine oriented. No one's ever built a commercial team like that before. It was always generics. Or you were selling an innovative drug to the top 100 hospitals, where the KOLs, you know, all had been asking, can you please approve this drug for 7 years? Suddenly in commercial, you need to educate at thousands of hospitals for oncology, thousands. The scale, the cost of investment to build a commercial team like that is huge. And, you know, we're clearly in that space. You know, the industry can't go build 20 good teams. By the way, I don't know that it can build 6 good teams. You know, you're going to need a critical mass of really exciting science, innovation, impactful drugs to get the best science and medical people on a team. You don't want the generic salespeople. You want the people that can speak science and medicine and, you know, work with innovative products. That's a new talent pool too. It hasn't existed in China. There's going to be a critical mass and scale question for sure in the commercial organizations in China. If you pick the wrong partner and they fail to get that, you know, you'll limit your market opportunity in the second largest market in the world for the life of your product. And I think a lot of people right now are focused on upfronts. They're focused on milestones. Their point, Chris, what's a reasonable deal look like? I don't know, and we're doing a lot of them. By the way, I think a lot of them are really stupid. You look at the terms and you're like, this doesn't make any sense. It's also really important that the cost of goods sold works, because for a lot of these products, you know, you're in early development, you have to make a choice. Do I optimize cost early or not? A lot of biotech companies don't want to invest in that. But for me, if I'm trying to commercialize in China, it's important the cost of goods sold is low because the margin's going to be lower. So there's some inherent things that as you get into a partnership, your China partner is going to want to drive, you may not care about. So you need to make sure you structure things the right way in the beginning. I think that there is going to be a huge, you know, field of failed collaborations because the economics aren't going to work. The partners aren't going to be the right folks. And you're going to see a lot of stranded assets that really struggle in the future because you're not thinking this through. You do not want to do a deal with a partner where they're not going to make any money. It may look good now, you may feel good now, but like it's going to be a disaster in the future. And so that's not what anyone wants. And I think there are deals being done that make no sense. And you just wonder, there's deals that you wonder, can that company ever build scale? I think from the other perspective, there's the ability to do a deal with a multinational pharmaceutical company. AstraZeneca has done very, very well in China, for example, and that's an option. There's any company is an option. I do think there's also a scenario where I don't think China has an intention. Personally, I think they're welcoming these companies. The policy actually in some ways is better for a multinational pharma company right now than it is for a local company. It's true, it's shocking, but it's actually true. But I think they're welcoming this. But I do think to the degree that there's, political reaction the other way, there may be some risk that with some of these big players, there's, backlash where they get caught in the stream of things. And from that perspective, you may be collateral damage on the side of the road. So I think that you need to think it through. You need China. By the way, you need Europe. And I would argue very, very strongly, I'm the only person who says this, I say it repeatedly, you need the rest of the world. The world is not US, China, Japan, and Europe. There's billions more people and we need to get to them and we need to be affordable in those markets. And even if we only make, 1% margin in those territories, predominantly we're an upfront cost business. We need to figure out how to make that business model work and get these great innovations to those patients. Okay.
Great point,
I just
John.
want to underscore John's saying, it has always been difficult to justify the expense of drug development and, infrastructure and all that in almost any region or country outside of the US. The US margins have been really driving the justification of the investment. And then every company would naturally say, well, if I can get 20% margins or 15% in the US, I'll settle for 8 to 10% margins in Europe. And maybe it's less in China. AZ's proven, maybe it's not. But I think that the rest of the world really is predicated on what we've learned in China. If you can use those same global clinical trials to gain approval and some modicum of reimbursement, right? There are countries like Turkey and others that, reference, EMA and FDA. I think if the rest of the world did that, I think you would see more, proliferation of these drugs, as John says, should be the goal.
And I'll jump in with one quick fact too. I know there's a lot of viewers on the webcast from companies who are maybe wondering, is my asset right for China? Here's a quick, amazing sign of the times. The partnership deal that set the record for the largest upfront payment was an antibody drug conjugate. So think about that. Those are the types of medicines that, again, a few years ago, you wouldn't even be talking about. And now something like an ADC is setting a record in terms of a licensing deal. So I think there's opportunities for a lot of different things, a lot of different technologies, and all kinds of science in China today.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left. So I want to call on the panelists, starting with Pei. What takeaways would you like to deliver to the audience today?
Yeah, I think that, most of us would agree that, China is on the rising, right? I think it's something that we cannot ignore, despite the situation. And I do agree that I think that the population is really young. There's a lot of energy there. I think people talk about, they are doing Me Too drugs, and I think there's nothing wrong with it because they're training entrepreneurs, who are running these companies, and then there will be next generation of entrepreneurs who will come out with innovative drugs, right? So I think that the experience gain is really, really valuable and not to be underestimated. Actually, I have one question for John Euler. I don't know whether we have time, but because we're talking about drugs affordability, do you see Chinese companies being able to make drugs at such a lower cost that they will then go out to the Southeast Asia market, because this is a region, I'm also in APAC. This is a region where, multinational companies will look at it. It's so heterogeneous with the regulations and affordability that, maybe it's not so viewed importantly as other markets. Whereas Chinese companies are making drugs, innovative drugs, for example, anti-PD-1, so cheap that this is going to be very affordable to the Asia Pacific region. Yeah. So I don't know whether I have time to address that, but definitely be happy to hear the views from other panelists. Yeah.
Well, I don't think we have time, but maybe we can take that up offline, and we're planning other events. So we'll put that on the topic. Hamlin, would you like to offer some takeaways to the audience?
Yeah, I'm just looking the title of today's webinar in terms of, China 2020, the market, the booming, the impact of COVID-19. Actually, just from all the panelists' discussions and certainly some questions coming from the audience, and and the Mass Bio initiative, to me, actually, the COVID-19, there is some impact as well. But I think based what all you talk about, China is on the journey to the biotech booming. I feel there is no change in terms of that direction. So that's number one. The second, I think in terms of what, China markets and what potential, in terms of biotech market and what, here in US, what are the needs, what are I think the probably critical thing, think about, I think that market really need a lot more talents. And certainly access is one thing, but also as John, you already mentioned, I think that markets also need a more talent as well, that able to bring the innovative assets to that market and then to realize the value of the innovation.
And thank you. And to the lone American Chinese on the panel, Brad, some takeaways?
Yeah, no, I would just echo what I think everyone has said very well, which is that you can't ignore it. Even if you're not focused on doing business in China, China is going to have a major impact on our business globally. So, so just, it has, as John and others have said, it has drug pricing implications. It has research and development implications. This is a very interconnected world. And so the sooner you can get in front of it, the better, because it's something that's going to affect our industry, I think, in a big way over the coming years.
John Euler, a man who doesn't recognize borders, please offer us some takeaways.
Sure. No, I think that absolutely, I believe people in our industry are doing this because they're passionate about science and they're passionate about helping people. I think that's truly what drives, everyone on this call, everyone in our industry. And I think that, to that end, our issue is not, does great science work? It works. We're having huge impact. We are in cancer for sure. I think the question is, can we be affordable? And I think the only way for us to be affordable enough to really translate this great science to truly help people all around the world in as fast of a fashion as we can is to work together. And I think that, disease, cancer, we say cancer has no borders, neither do we. It's true. To fight something like that, you have to fight united and globally through collaboration. And we strongly, strongly believe that. And I think that, you can't ignore the rest of the world if you want to be affordable. We need everybody across the globe to be accessing these medicines, and we need them to be affordable. And so, let's work together to do that.
Chris Garabedian, we are in a brave new world. Please wrap it up.
Sure. Well, look, the one thing I would say is if COVID has taught us anything, it's that we are a global community, okay? If you think about what's necessary workers, it's the healthcare workers that are trying to keep people healthy and save lives. And, as Brad pointed out, this is an area that really should be exempt from any trade protectionist policies, all of that. And I think that nobody cares where a good treatment for COVID or a great vaccine will come from. They don't care what region of the world that comes from. And I think that really, that's where COVID could have a positive impact and a lesson for all of us to understand. And China is part of that community. And I think you've heard from this panel, you know, that it's thriving and it's here to stay. And you really need to be thinking about it if you're, you know, an emerging biotech or pharma company. And I just want to say congratulations, John, for putting together such a great panel and bringing the speakers together. It's been really enjoyable.
And thanks to all the panelists, and my thanks to Chris Lindgren, who really organized this, and she's been behind the scenes. But everybody, please send your thanks to Chris, and we look forward to the next one.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye now.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.